Welcome back. We're pleased to welcome Ibtisam Ahmed, who will speak about his personal experience of negotiating queerness as a Commonwealth immigrant. His presentation will mix historical information with personal experience and give us a unique insight into issues like xenophobia and racism in modern Britain.
Hi, thank you so much for including me in this program. My name is Ibtisam. My pronouns are he and him. I am a Bangladeshi immigrant. I've been living in the UK for the past 10 years. I moved here as a university student, and I'm still completing my university education. So I did my undergraduate and my master's, and I'm completing a PhD at the University of Nottingham. I'm also queer. I realize that the word is a bit contentious sometimes in English-speaking countries because it has been used as an insult and has particularly a very problematic past. But I think it's important for me to still use it because identities outside of English-speaking countries sometimes don't get translated in the LGBT acronym. So for a lot of us outside of English-speaking spaces, we tend to use queer as our identifier. So I do apologize if anyone personally doesn't want to use it for themselves, but I think it's important to recognize why that may function for others. I should also offer a slightly more light-hearted disclaimer. I do have a cat, so if we ever get Zoom bombed, that's his fault. But going into what I'd actually like to talk about and share today, the UK is the first ever country I've lived in where it's been legal for me to be in a same-gender relationship. And it's been a very liberating experience. I've come to terms with my sexuality in a very safe and accepting way. I have found several community groups. I've joined student associations, and it's most importantly allowed me the space to be and to grow. But there's also a very complicated legacy behind that makes it almost painful that the UK is the country where I've experienced this. And the reason for that is because of the history of colonialism. And I think it's important for LGBT History Month that the more uncomfortable aspects of history are also engaged with and understood. Back in 1861, what is now Bangladesh was part of the British Raj. So Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, parts of Myanmar were all part of one colonial jurisdiction. And what ended up happening in 1861 was the introduction of a law known as Section 377. Prior to the introduction of Section 377, sexuality was broadly understood and experienced. It would be unfair of me to say it was a completely perfect place for everyone who was queer, but there was a variation across the region in how accepted it was. In Bengal, which is where Bangladesh is now, the overall experience was that there isn't really a distinction between queer identities, or at least what we'd understand as queer identities today, and cisgender heterosexual identities. There were some layers of discrimination when it came to institutions such as marriage and family, but being in relationships with someone of the same gender was not frowned upon unless you were cheating on a spouse. And in that case, it was the fact that you were cheating that was a problem. So what we can infer is that queerness was at least a part of society. And most importantly, it was not criminalized. So whether or not social acceptance for it was high or low, there was no legal structure under which queer individuals could be punished. But that changed under Section 377. 377 was introduced to try and criminalize any type of sex that wasn't aimed at having children. So it was a very kind of Christian, puritanical, sex is for children, not for pleasure kind of law. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, the only way that that could be properly implemented was doing random checks and bursting into bedrooms when people were having sex. So what it ended up being actually used for was targeting same-gender couples for discrimination, because the general understanding was couples of the same gender could not engage in having sex for the purposes of having children. So the law started as a very specific thing, but then it evolved into criminalizing homosexuality. Even though the actual wording of the law never changed, it became about targeting homosexuals. And it's important to understand why it was able to take hold, because as I mentioned, prior to Section 377, there was a general acceptance. But at the same time, as I mentioned, there wasn't really an understanding of what it meant to be queer. So there were gender diverse communities. There was a diversity in non-binary identities, such as the Hijra community. But in terms of sexuality, it was just, you do what you do. You love who you love. So what that meant is that Section 377 was the very first time that these identities were officially recognized. They were officially recognized as a bad criminal thing. So since the implementation of the law, the perception around sexuality changed. It started in what is now South Asia, what is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. The law was then taken over to colonies in Australia. It was tweaked, it was made stricter. So the initial punishment was either a fine or a prison sentence. When it moved over to Australia, it became a strict prison sentence. It then got taken back to South Asia, where it was re-implemented with the prison sentence. And then the law got shifted over to British colonies in the Middle East, in Africa, and the Caribbean. In the modern day, in 2021, 72 countries make it a criminal offense to be in a same-gender relationship, according to the Human Dignity Trust. Of those 72 countries, 35 are in the Commonwealth. And the vast majority of those 35 actually still have the original colonial law still in their legal books and constitutions. So what we're seeing is a historical law still being used to discriminate against LGBTQ plus individuals in these countries. Now, I would be extremely remiss to suggest that it's all in the past. Bangladesh is now a very homophobic country. It's complicated by the fact that there's been an increasing shift towards religious conservatism in the past decade. So prior to that, we used to be a lot more secular, and now we've sort of moved away from that. And most of these countries have gained independence from colonialism decades ago. So to suggest that, you know, we don't have our own ways of fixing things is also disingenuous. I do hold my own country and my own country's laws at fault. But part of the problem is the narrative around LGBT rights, because initially homosexuality was criminalized under colonialism. But what we've seen since the end of World War II, in particular, since the advent of the Stonewall riots and global pride, is there's been a repackaging of LGBT rights as this great success of Western liberal society. And unfortunately, what that does in socially conservative countries like Bangladesh is that it makes queer individuals like myself face two problems. On the one hand, there's the historical criminalization that was actually created, in our case, by the West. But there's also this misconception that queerness is a Western idea. So a lot of very traditional Bangladeshis don't want to accept that LGBTQ rights are actually part of our history. It certainly doesn't help that the criminalization all these decades ago has led to an erasure of our history and has led to sources being removed and burned and books being censored. So what we've seen as a result of this kind of focus on Western history is this strange catch-22 where we are criminalized because of the West, but our continued criminalization is because we are seen as products of the West. So when I live in the UK, I have a very, very strange experience of this because I'm in no way going to ignore the fact that I am free here. I am an individual who gets to live and love openly. I am fully protected under the law because I am here under a student visa. But it's strange that this is the country where I finally experienced all of this. And what it doesn't take away from is the fact that there is still a lot of discrimination for me in the UK. Because of my surname, I present as Muslim, and particularly since the Brexit referendum, but also whenever there is a global Islamist terrorist attack, I'm often on the receiving end of a lot of abuse. While the LGBTQ community doesn't really want to always admit it, there's also a lot of racism in our community. And I've been on the receiving end of that as well. So it's this misconception here that if you're part of one minority, you can't really be prejudiced, which erases the fact that there are those of us who are made a minority on multiple fronts. So it's a complicated existence. It's one I'm very proud to be able to live openly, which is a huge privilege compared to many of my fellow Bangladeshis, especially those who are still currently living in Bangladesh. But it's tough. Now, as someone who studies history, my big point about history and learning from history is where do we take those lessons forward? So I've shared some of the challenges that I face, and I hope it's made people be reflective and thoughtful. But what I'd also like to offer are some concrete ways that people can take this forward. So if it comes to local organizations, schools, councils, any form of local outreach, I definitely encourage understanding where ethnic minorities, particularly queer ethnic minorities, may be coming from. And there needs to be a greater understanding of how we navigate these spaces. Increasingly, there are more and more groups which are exclusively for queer people of color. Nottingham has one. I'm very proud to be a member. It's called QTI POC. We call it QTPOC. It means queer, trans, and intersex people of color. A lot of cities have them. If you don't, maybe consider starting one. And they're great spaces for, first of all, folks like myself to find a sense of community and solidarity, but it's also a great platform to then push for broader education. Because as a group, we were able to lead Nottinghamshire Pride, which is a lot harder to do as just an individual, but if you have a specific group and a direction and angle to take that, you may be able to get more access to education and platforms to educate others with. I would also encourage being as active as possible with government. The UK has a dedicated all-party parliamentary group for global LGBT rights. It's across parties, and it will exist regardless of who is in government. And it does some amazing work because what its focus is on understanding how the UK can interact with LGBTQ activists in other parts of the world and uplift them. And this is important because I'm going to use another historical example here. When David Cameron was still Prime Minister of the UK, there was an attempt in Uganda to strengthen their anti-homosexuality laws. British press was in outrage mode. British LGBT organizations were very worried, and David Cameron's response to that was threatening to cut off aid to Uganda. And in the UK, that was seen as an extremely brave stance. Unfortunately, Ugandan LGBTQ activists didn't want that to happen, because what that effectively did, and when it was implemented, it still did that, was that it reinforced the idea that LGBTQ rights are a Western imposition. And it only strengthened the opposition to LGBTQ identities and minorities, because other minorities who were now being affected by humanitarian aid being cut off started to blame the LGBTQ minorities because of that. The right thing to do then would have been to actually listen to the activists in the country. And this is why history and context is important, because although the goal is the same, although what we're all striving for, hopefully, is equal rights, the way we achieve them happens in very different ways in very different countries. And we need to be able to listen to that. I would not want Bangladeshi hijra and trans activists, and indeed Bangladeshi cisgender gay activists like myself, to come to the UK and tell the trans community here how to fight their struggles. What I should be doing is uplifting their voices. And that's the same principle. So we need to learn our histories. We need to be able to untangle them and support each other. Something that the UK should do at some point is own up to its history of colonialism formally, ideally apologize for it, because what that would do is allow LGBTQ activists in countries like Bangladesh to go, see, we told you it was a Western imposition, not homosexuality, but banning homosexuality. And that would let us reclaim a lot of our history without having to face the lie that we are Western impositions. We're not. I'm certainly not. I was always queer. I just was in the closet. So it's that context that we need to focus on. It's that history that we need to reclaim. Within the UK itself, there are also steps that need to be taken. One of the biggest challenges that many LGBTQ individuals across the Commonwealth face with regards to the UK is many of us seek to come to the UK as asylum seekers and refugees, because the UK does protect LGBTQ identity and offers LGBTQ asylum seekers a safe haven. Unfortunately, the UK has very, very inhumane asylum laws. Currently, asylum seekers can be detained in what are called detention centers, but are effectively just prisons indefinitely. The UK doesn't have a law that says you can't keep people imprisoned beyond a certain number of years if they're asylum seekers. The average length of time it takes for an LGBTQ asylum seeker to have their case heard, and this isn't even resolved, this is heard, is 13 years. Imagine being in 13 years in a prison because you sought safety, because you were promised safety. And many of these cases are also denied because the government, again, uses a very British idea of what it means to be LGBT. We've seen individuals get deported because they haven't read Oscar Wilde. We've seen individuals get deported because, oh, you can't be a lesbian, you have long hair, or you can't be gay, you don't know what drink to order at a nightclub. And this specific one was targeted at a Saudi Arabian, where Saudi Arabia is a non-alcoholic country. They don't have nightclubs. If they do, it's mostly for access for foreign dignitaries. So what we need over and over and over and over and over again is more historical understanding, more understanding of differences in our community, celebrating our diversity, and letting that take center stage. So if any of you feel like you want to take some sort of action, write to your local councils. If any of you are from cities that have a local detention center, complain, reach out, lobby about that. There are two fantastic groups that work within the UK around LGBT rights globally. One is called Kaleidoscope Trust, and they work in conjunction with the Commonwealth Equality Network, which is a network of LGBTQ activists from around the Commonwealth. So Kaleidoscope Trust is the British partner for that. And they work to increase LGBTQ rights across the Commonwealth. The other group I would say is, two groups actually, would be the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, which offers legal advice to asylum seekers, and Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants, which is an offshoot of the historic Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors. And what they do is they agitate for more change, and they agitate for greater acceptance of LGBTQ plus asylum seekers, immigrants, and refugees in the UK. So I hope that these are concrete steps that you can maybe take. Invite these speakers to your places, invite these speakers to your schools, your councils, your public events. And I'd probably end this by saying History Month is an amazing time because we get to share a lot of this, but I hope that the engagement with these issues doesn't die out on the 1st of March. History Month should be the start of these conversations, not the end of them. So I hope that we continue these forward. And I look forward to listening to more ideas and taking some questions now.
Okay, so we've got 4 questions at the moment. First one is, could you suggest some further reading on the history of queer people or understanding of sexual and gender diversity pre-colonial times?
Sure. So again, I stress that it was very different in different parts of the world. So my experience comes specifically from a South Asian perspective. I wouldn't want to speak for other parts of the world. If you're looking for like a book, the author Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai have 2 amazing books about LGBTQ experiences in India, or well, British India, so it's India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh now. And what they've done is they've collected several stories, plays, songs, devotional prayers, and translated them, and they cover a very, very long time period from several centuries ago to just before and even during colonialism, to look at different ways in which LGBTQ identities were experienced and celebrated in pre-colonial India. If books are a problem, especially in the middle of the pandemic, and I'm also very aware that because it's an academic style book, it may be slightly expensive. I would actually recommend looking at the individual groups that are mentioned on the Commonwealth Equality Network website. I don't want to point any of them out directly because sometimes for security reasons, they take their website details down. But if you go to the Commonwealth Equality Network page, you'll find a list of all of the LGBTQ plus organizations in the different parts of the Commonwealth that are okay to be contacted and are okay to have their own websites available. And a lot of them have recommended readings. A lot of them have contact details for historians you can get in touch with, or just local activists who can maybe point you in the right direction. So that's maybe that one probably involves more work, but it's also more accessible because it's free. So those would be the two I'd recommend. I think Netflix used to have a documentary on LGBT rights in India. It's slightly outdated because India in 2018 repealed Section 377, which is an amazing and very historic moment. But it still carries a lot of really good history. I'm afraid I don't remember the exact name of it at the moment, but if you go on Netflix and look at their LGBT collection, there is an Indian documentary. It's in English, but it's a documentary from India, and it talks about the different experiences there. So those are the three kind of different ways of looking at it I'd recommend.
Thank you. The next question is from Melissa, who asks, how important do you think representation of historic queer people of colour is for people of colour today? At Ancient House, we often speak about Princess Catherine Duleep Singh, daughter of last Maharaja of Punjab, who was a lesbian. Some have found her a positive role model for empowerment, others have called it tokenism.
I think it's a very challenging experience, and it's also, I don't know what the correct way of going about it is. I think the challenge with increasing diversity is that it's got to start somewhere. And oftentimes when it starts just one or two individuals, it can feel like tokenism, and I think that's a valid critique. Personally, I'd rather these stories be told than not. But I would also want to ensure that these stories are told authentically, because sometimes what can end up happening is using a Western framework to understand these stories, which wouldn't be fair. But also, the representation shouldn't just be in the material, it should be in who curates the material, who shares these experiences. If I looked at today's program and saw that someone who wasn't a Commonwealth immigrant was talking about the experiences of a Commonwealth immigrant, I would be very concerned. And the reason for that is we as queer Commonwealth immigrants exist, and we as queer Commonwealth immigrants in the UK exist. So it's safe for some of us to speak up, right? So it's understanding which voices can be highlighted. It's understanding sometimes it may not be possible. And I understand certainly in an age where it's increasingly difficult to get things like funding, it may be very, very difficult to host a very diverse panel. But within the best of capabilities, within the best of possibilities, try to engage with the communities that are actually being affected. Personally, I'm thrilled to hear that these histories are being shared in Ancient House, and I think more of that needs to happen. But perhaps if it is being called out on tokenism, I would say reflect on who's doing the calling out and why. Because sometimes it is a gut reaction, but sometimes it's also very legitimate and needs to be understood. But I would encourage you to keep doing it and expand on it.
Thank you. And the next question is, do you think the move to decolonize over the summer and Black Lives Matter is going in the right direction, or is it too inward looking to make a difference?
I wouldn't want to comment on Black Lives Matter because I'm not Black. And I think Black Lives Matter and decolonization are two separate issues. Not that they are not connected, and not that as someone, for instance, who works on decolonization, I should be supporting Black Lives Matter and I should be uplifting Black Lives Matter. But I don't feel it's my place to necessarily reflect on it and critique it. With regards to decolonization, I think there's some amazing work that's being done. I work on decolonization at my university here at Nottingham. What we've seen happen is a misunderstanding of what decolonization means. And I'll give another example. Recently, the University of Leicester cancelled its medieval English courses. The reason it did so was very, very, very highly connected to just issues of money. The pandemic meant fewer students were enrolling, the course was no longer viable, they wanted to reduce the amount they pay staff, and it was easier to get rid of a course and fire the staff than it was to try and reduce staff pay across the university. What Leicester said in its statement is that we are committed to decolonization and we are worried that this course was too white. That is ridiculous. No one who works on decolonization would look at a medieval English course and say that's too white. Decolonization is about understanding where a lot of these issues stand in different parts of academia. And it isn't necessarily just about increasing the visibility of people of color in the course. It's also about understanding why students of color might not take certain courses, why students of color might have views that don't feel represented in some courses. So if you want to decolonize the medieval English course, and I don't have experience with medieval English course in Leicester, so I don't actually know how much it needed to be decolonized in the first place. But the move towards that wouldn't be shoehorn in non-English people of color, because that goes against the ethos of what the course is. It would be about understanding how to make it more inclusive. And that's a problem, because what we're seeing now is a lot of people misunderstanding decolonization, and a lot of organizations that don't want to support decolonization using it as a scapegoat. And we've seen that with Priyam Vadagopal, who is a member staff at the University of Cambridge, who does a lot of work on decolonization, and she has been called out in so many tabloids as being someone who is angry at white people. That's not what she's doing. She is just consistently trying to make people reflect and critique on how history is taught. And that's not a bad thing. So the actual movement of decolonization, I think, is fantastic, needs to be supported. Where I think efforts need to be doubled is in people supporting it, and it's in people understanding what it actually means, and rejecting this gut reaction to, oh, decolonization is bad. Also, don't take it personally. That's another thing that I think is very important to highlight. Decolonization isn't an attack on British values, whatever that might be. Decolonization is understanding some of the uncomfortable histories of where this comes from and making sure that Britain is really as inclusive as it claims to be.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from Sabrina, and they say, thank you so much for such an eye-opening talk. What you discussed about queerness being seen as a Western imposition made them wonder if, in your own experience, do you find that, sorry, I don't know what this acronym stands for, it's BIPOC, people are often assumed to be cishet. They're basing this on their own experience as an Asian queer person. They once mentioned to their friend that almost everyone in the UK that they've told has been surprised, and they thought it was because they looked stereotypically straight, but their friend thought it was because society doesn't see LGBTQ-ness in non-Western people. They're just wondering what other people think because they've never discussed this with anyone before.
thank you for sharing that and sending love and solidarity as a fellow cutie puck. BIPOC, for anyone who isn't aware, stands for Black and Indigenous People of Color. It's a different kind of, it's just an alternative to BME, which is Black and Minority Ethnic, which is more commonly used in the UK. There's a huge struggle with that because you're absolutely right. Globally, the diversity of queer folks of color often gets erased. And I mean, I can't, so in South Asia, Hijra is a very visible queer sub-community. They self-identify as a third gender. So we could, you know, if we had to use English terminology, we'd understand them as trans and non-binary, but they have a very specific gender and cultural identity. And they're very visible in South Asia. But we don't see that same visibility represented globally. And of course, part of that is because queerness is still criminalized. You don't even see queerness unless it's the butt of a joke, right? But there's still this move towards erasing some of these identities. Polynesian islanders have Fa'afafing communities. Other parts of South Asia have Gothi communities. So there's, and even ethnic minorities in white spaces. So Roma communities, traveler communities have their own ways of understanding queerness. And more of these voices were given a platform. We're seeing some of this very, very slowly. In the US, at least, we've seen a lot of success for the TV show Pose. And India Moore, who is one of the leads in the show, is very proudly Black and very proudly non-binary. They talk a lot about their experiences of both. What would be great is seeing that same level of platform being offered to queer people of color in the UK. And I'm sure there are so many of us who'd be able to share stories. So I think it's about opening up those platforms, you know, for some of us, it's about fighting for those platforms. For those of us who are not queer people of color, it would be, you know, maybe help us uplift our voices, because that would be great. And I think just even you talking about your experience and your story, making that more available, you know, those are things we need to hear. Those are things we need to understand. And that includes understandings within our own communities, although that's more of an inter-community conversation.
Hey, thank you. I think that's all of the questions at the moment. If anyone else has any more, please feel free to send them in. Yeah, I think that's it.
May I share a story from our exhibition that sort of links to the conversation that the question that the person was just asking? Would that be okay? Thinking about our exhibition included the story of Catherine Duleep Singh, and a lot of my colleagues, white colleagues, told me we shouldn't include it because the Sikh community will not be open to this story. We didn't listen to these concerns because we thought it was part of our authentic representation of who Princess Catherine was. And when we had a very large group of older Sikh ladies come from a Gurdwara, everybody was nervous. Oh, they will be offended. But no, they spoke beautifully about how moved they were to see that she was happy that she had somebody. And there was complete acceptance in that group of, you know, they were mostly concerned, you know, had she been well loved? Did she have a lovely person to be with? And I think that gave me a lot of confidence to think that we do need to talk about these things and tackle mainly my fellow white people's fear that we mustn't talk about these things in different communities. So while I totally agree with you, we could not have done it without our friends in the Sikh community who were able to help us with the best way to do it. I think it was really important that we were able to be, offering a platform to tell that story.
I think on that point, actually, something that gets erased a lot is obviously, and this exists both within the diaspora here in the UK, but also from my experience, it's certainly common in Bangladesh. I wouldn't want to speak for other Commonwealth countries. Obviously, young folks tend to be viewed, rightfully in some ways, a bit of a stereotype in others, as being more accepting. But what I've also noticed is that people of my grandparents' generation are also very, very open to these ideas. And part of that is because people in my grandparents' generation were the ones who fought against colonialism and who fought for independence. So for them, it's very much about going, well, you know what, we fought for a right to live freely, why shouldn't other minorities? What you often tend to see is that it's people who traditionally tend to be of my parents' generation, the generation between. I hasten to add that my parents have been lovely, but it's been mostly, generationally, it's been people of my parents' generation who tend to have a slightly more conservative outlook. And a lot of that is tied in with the kinds of sources they have access to, but also because they haven't had the same struggle as my grandparents' generation has. They often are just comfortable leaving society as is. I've seen that same dynamic played out in the diaspora, where it's the generations that initially moved to the UK who are a lot more willing to fight for equal rights. The generation down from them tend to be like, no, we've made our home here, let's not ruffle feathers. And then the generation down from that goes, well, no, actually, we're taught that we need to keep up these fights. So, and the reason I point that out is because a lot of people tend to listen to that middle generation as representative of the entire community, but that is obviously not the case. They just happen to be the ones who get represented more and who have louder voices. So it's, even within our communities, we have different responses and different approaches to all of this.
Lovely, thank you. If you wouldn't mind, someone's made a comment in the Q&A and it mentions Polari, and Ian is asking if you would mind him gate crashing in and answering that question. Would that be okay with you?
That would be great. I'd love to hear that as well. No, absolutely.
Super. Let's just bring Ian in. May, can you read out that comment from Robin, just so everyone knows what we're talking about in the Q&A?
Sure. So Robert's statement says that they're researching the queer histories of their hometown and have been disappointed by the level of racism among older members of the LGBTQ plus communities that they've interviewed. They've even come across racist Polari terms being used to describe people of colour.
Right, hello, Robert. Yeah, I think that's a very valid comment. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, can hear you.
Good, yeah. Lovely. Yeah, it's really because a lot of them are very, a lot of older people are just older people, and they've grown up at a time when those sorts of opinions were the norm. I grew up in a racist household. I've still got a racist brother, to be honest, who hated immigrants, but then went to live in Singapore and became one, although he would have called himself an expat. Yeah, I think a lot of it is upbringing. And I think even for myself, my life since I left home at the age of 19 has been a very slow and unfinished process of re-educating myself. I think I grew up with racist views, and I had racist views. And also talking about Polari terms as well, it's not just racism, it's anti-women as well. You'll notice in my talk, I talked about gay men. There was no mention of women. It was a language that was largely used by gay men, and some of the terms for, women was, were highly derogatory. I mean, like one word for women was fish. And I won't explain it unless you really need it explaining, but it's a highly derogatory term. And also words for, you know, like there was also the term dinge queen, meaning a white man who's into black men. And that means actually treating them not as people, but as a fetish. So yeah, I'm afraid you will find those attitudes amongst older people. It's easy to think that because, you know, because we're all queer, we're going to be, you know, sort of anti-discrimination, totally anti-discrimination. It doesn't quite work like that, unfortunately.
I think if I could add to that, and thank you so much for having that as such a reflective point, because it's always important for us in the queer community to reflect on where we could do better as well. You know, my experiences of the dating scene often included, because I used to use dating apps, a lot of times they would include straight off the bat, no fats, no femmes, no blacks, no Asians. And I think one of the issues there is this massive misconception in parts of the queer community that it's just a preference, without understanding where the kind of social discrimination that created those preferences came into play. So I think what we need to be able to do is really challenge a lot of that. And, you know, as I'm sure I have a lot of transphobia to unlearn as a cis person. I've been raised in a transphobic environment, and I think that's what it is. It's we're raised in environments that are structurally unfair and unequal. And regardless of how well-intentioned we may be as individuals, we internalize a lot of that. So a lot of it's about being humble enough to know where we're wrong and learn from that. And I think this is a great point to, you know, let's listen to minorities within minorities as well.
Excellent. I'm going to butt out again now. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a wonderful sort of point to reiterate that, you know, we've all got work to do, haven't we? We've all got self-reflection to do, and you've given us a great range of fantastic resources. I was trying to keep up with you mentioning all the places and posting the links into the chat. And one of our participants, Nick, has been brilliant about providing some other links. He's linked to a book that has got you know, a good anthology of articles for people to look at, and various other organisations and websites. I do apologise I've missed any. You were rattling through lots of brilliant connections.
I saw them all
I hope
pop
I've
up,
got
so it's
them.
all great.
Super. May, do you want to say any last words?
Just thank you for coming and speaking. It's been really interesting to have you here, and yeah.
Thank you for having me. Something I'm really appreciative of is 10 years ago when I first moved here, I wouldn't have seen as much of a variety in presentations, and I think it's a really encouraging sign to see where we as a community are headed as well. And you know, let's keep that engagement going is what I'd end with. So, you know, again, just a reminder that there's work to be done, and it is sobering, but perhaps ending on a hopeful note of we can do it, and we should.